A top Trump administration official said Sunday the partial government shutdown could extend into the new year. Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney told Fox News the spending battle is likely to drag on. This would pass on the funding fight to the new Congress in 2019. Democrats will take over the House the first week of January. But a deal could be wrapped up sooner, depending on the political winds in Washington. The Senate is set to reconvene on Thursday. Here's CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe.
With no deal expected until after Christmas, about a quarter of the federal government began shutting down this weekend. NASA's workforce is almost entirely furloughed, which means our eye in the sky is scheduled to close. But at the National Zoo, the star attraction is still visible. On Capitol Hill, there were no signs of progress.
Deliver us from the pitfalls of political brinksmanship.
Even prayers can't stop the shutdown, now set to continue through the holidays.
We pushed the pause button until the president and Senate Democrats reach an agreement.
President Trump is demanding $5 billion for a southern border wall, but Democrats refuse.
President Trump, if you want to open the government, you must abandon the wall.
For his part, the president had lunch with Republican allies on Saturday. Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz was there.
We could be in for an extended shutdown in the absence of border security funding because this is the fight the president wants to have.
This is Ed O'Keefe in Washington.
The government shutdown and President Trump's decision to pull troops out of Syria were at the center of the Sunday morning talk shows. Here's some of what you may have missed.
This is what Washington looks like when you have a president who refuses to sort of go along to get along. You're seeing a fight over border security. It's very possible that this shutdown will go beyond the 28th and into the new Congress.
There is, frankly, no path towards his getting $5 billion in American taxpayer money to meet his campaign promise of a big, beautiful wall with Mexico.
This is a made-up fight, so the president can look like he's fighting. But even if he wins, our borders are going to be insecure.
We have an impulsive president. We know that. But you also know that we can't pass any spending bill in the Senate without Democrat support.
So let me be clear. Democrats are not going to agree to any funding to build new border wall? None?
That's correct. None.
One of the things I've often said to the president is when you're executing on executive power in government, there has to be a strategy that has an end game. And what I'm concerned about is what Rich said. I don't know what the end game is here. And it hasn't been articulated.
I've never seen a situation like this in which almost every important area that is key to this country is confronting crisis.
Zach Cohen joins me now from Washington. He's a Senate correspondent for the National Journal. Zach, thanks so much for being with us. You've been reporting on the shutdown, writing, quote, "In the past, Congress has passed short-term measures to let negotiators cool off and punt the fight to another day. Why is this time different?"
Essentially, both sides have dug in their heels. We have the president's base on one side, who just lost a number of seats in the House, as well as the majority of Senate races that were on the ballot, who believe that this is really their last chance to get border security funding through a unified Congress with both Republican control of the House and the Senate. Democrats will take over the House on January 3rd, whereas Democrats feel like they're emboldened by these gains and feel like no money should go toward a border wall or a concrete wall, or as Senator Dick Durbin, the minority whip this morning, said, a medieval wall. And so essentially there's very little room for negotiation, and anything that's happened behind closed doors really hasn't seen much progress yet.
So to follow up, the president Sunday doubled down on his immigration policy, tweeting, quote, "It is only a good old-fashioned wall that works." So at this point, is basically the only way forward to include funding for this demand, or are there any other options available to Congress?
So the two factors are really both the money as well as what the money will be spent on. Congress in the past has appropriated money for fencing or for some sort of see-through barrier between the United States and Mexico. There was about $1.6 billion in one of the more recent appropriations this year. And there was a deal for another $1.6 on the table this year that appropriators both on the left and the right agreed to. and that was put on pause. Instead, President Trump is calling for a wall, $5 billion, something the House passed earlier, but the Senate instead has offered only a clean CR, a continuing resolution that only keeps current funding levels at about $1.3 billion. And so if Democrats can feel like they can offer more spending for border security in terms of drones, in terms of technology, or fencing, as they have in the past, then you could start to see some movement. But Republicans would also need to bring the funding levels down from $5 billion, which seems to be dead on arrival in the Senate, which does require Democratic votes to pass.
Well, you also write this, quote, "It's questionable whether there will be any political consequences for the GOP," which is really interesting. What are the potential implications that could result, you think, when this fight is over eventually?
So you have to remember that there were 2 shutdowns earlier this year, and it really didn't register as a big campaign issue in the final weeks of the 2018 elections. They were mostly about health care or about the economy or about immigration to a certain extent, but very little about the failure of Washington to appropriate money on time, both in January and a short one in February. The next federal elections won't take place until 2020, when President Trump will be on the ballot, as well as the entirety of the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate. And a lot of stuff can happen. We just, this past week alone, all of the news we saw, it would not surprise me if this was a forgotten factor by the time 2020 rolls around.
Right, especially given the nature of our news cycles these days. It seems like last week was like a year ago. All right. Well, the earliest lawmakers are going to be back is this Thursday, leaving exactly a week until Democrats take over the House. So how is that impacting the funding fight?
So really, there are very few discussions going on right now. One of Schumer's spokesmen told me the other day that there was an offer made from Republicans, and they're still very far apart. And a Democrat familiar with negotiations said Democrats also made an offer, but that hasn't gone anywhere. If there was a final deal that had been worked out between congressional leadership and the president, the Congress would be voting. They would bring everybody together. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that he would provide 24 hours notice to senators to come back to Washington to fund the government if there was a deal in place, but wouldn't hold a vote until then. So at this point, yes, the Senate is in adjournment until Thursday, with the exception of a pro forma session on Monday. So it seems unlikely that any deal will be reached before then, especially since all the legislative leaders have left town for Christmas.
Well, meantime, the stock market is in a severe decline. The Dow Jones just had its worst week since the financial crisis in 2008. How are the conflicts in Washington impacting the economy?
So the market can be fickle, and it is affected by news. It can be affected by things like the president saying he wants to fire the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, which typically is an independent institution. It can be affected by generally news in general. Political instability can affect fiscal stability. And so as more news comes out of Washington and around the world, that can cause investors to say, wait a second, I'm not sure I want to spend money right now. Maybe I should hold on to it. And while the stock market is not necessarily the end-all, be-all of measuring the strength of an economy, you can look at jobs numbers, you can look at wage growth. It certainly is a visible aspect of that. And as families gather for Christmas and are trying to decide how to invest their money next year even, certainly these signs are not helpful.
Yeah, and it's a metric that the president has taken credit for in the past when those numbers for the stock market have been up. Well, the president has reportedly considered firing the Federal Reserve chairman. Does the president actually have the authority to remove Jerome Powell from the post?
The law is unclear on this, but OMB Director Mick Mulvaney did say this morning that Trump has realized that he doesn't really have that authority, or at least it's not clear-cut. It's not like a cabinet position that's confirmed by the Senate and then serves at the pleasure of the president. It is an independent body that is supposed to make decisions mostly on interest rates, regardless of what the politics of the moment are or what the whims of the president are. So, no, we can expect Powell to stick around for a while, but it's certainly another indication that when the president is unhappy with the current state of affairs, he tends to forward it along to somebody else in government and tries to find ways to shift that blame and try to correct course if there's a way to do that.
As we heard a moment ago from our David Martin, who broke this news, President Trump is forcing out Defense Secretary Jim Mattis sooner than the February 28th that the Defense Secretary had put on his resignation letter. I wonder if I could just get your take. Why do you think there's this rushed departure here, that the president isn't content to wait until February 28th before announcing a replacement and having one in sooner?
So Secretary Mattis had, as you said, was going to stay until February 28th in time for the president to nominate a new Secretary of Defense and potentially get it confirmed by the Senate when they reconvene in January. However, the letter that very publicly Secretary Mattis released explaining why he was leaving laid out a number of ways that he disagreed with President Trump in terms of his relationships with current allies as well as foreign adversaries like China and Russia. And the president probably didn't appreciate that too much and decided that he was ready to show Secretary Mattis the door. Acting Secretary Shanahan on January 1st will hold that position until there is a new Senate-confirmed Secretary of Defense. I spoke to a number of senators before they left town last week, and a lot of them were very disturbed by Secretary Mattis's exit, and they would like to see somebody similar to the Secretary of Defense, a Mattis clone, if you will, somebody who will be able to keep the country safe and adhere to some of the international norms that have governed American foreign policy for decades.
Well, we know that Syria was, in fact, a really divisive point between the president and his now outgoing defense secretary. And the president, though, defended the decision to pull troops from Syria this weekend, tweeting, quote, "Allies are very important, but not when they take advantage." At this point, Zach, is it clear who is actually advising the president when it comes to foreign policy, whose counsel he is actually following?
No, it's not. I mean, we have a number of foreign policy advisors that are still around in the White House since the beginning of the administration. People like Stephen Miller, who has been very public on the border security fight, is sort of a hardline conservative on these issues. You have John Bolton, the national security advisor, who's still there and is also rather conservative, the former UN ambassador. But in terms of we have also Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is still there and is seen as pretty solidly safe in his current job. One thing I heard from Congress, though, is that they were not consulted on this decision. So whoever the president decided to talk to before that, it wasn't senators, it wasn't the Foreign Relations Committee. And that disturbed them, I think, more than anything else, more than just the decision to pull out of Syria itself. So I'll be curious to see when Congress convenes in January, what they'll try to do to rein in the president on foreign policy and use the power of the purse that the Constitution does grant Congress on these matters.
All right, Zach Cohen, Zach in Washington for us. Thanks so much.
Anytime.